Delighted to kick off the first session of day 2 of the AI Research Intensive with a talk by Dr. Julian Acosta. In Julian's lecture, he will be covering how to critique a paper and respond. So without further ado, Julian, please take it away.
Thank you, Pranav, for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here now. So I am Julian Acosta. I am a neurologist by training, but I spent the past few years working as a postdoctoral researcher at your university. I am currently working as a clinical data scientist at Rad AI. Sorry, there's an Alexa showing an alarm. Okay, so the lecture is going to be about how to critique a paper and respond to reviewers. For the learning outcomes for this lecture, we have the first point is to understand how the review process works, because this is something that sometimes varies between different journals and sometimes varies between different venues, but the entire process is quite similar in general. The second learning outcome is how to write thoughtful and constructive critiques for a paper. And the third learning outcome is going to be note how to effectively respond to reviewers' comments when you get reviews from a journal, for example. Okay, so to start with how the peer review process works, here's a figure that depicts how the process works in general. This process can vary across different journals and across different conferences, but in general is relatively the same. So basically, when you first write a paper and you have it like in the form that you want to submit it, you submit it to a journal, and the first person to actually review the papers are usually staff from the journal that I will check the formatting of the journal of the submission to make sure that it meets the journal requirements. But when that first check is passed, the first person actually looking at the science will be an editor. The editor here will basically assess your submission and see if it merits sending it to peer review by other scientists. Here, the editor, what it usually looks like is the overall quality of the paper, and usually also takes into account the scope of the journal that you're submitting to make sure it's a good fit. So at this step, the decisions that can arise are either rejection, in which case it will be called an editorial rejection, so you don't get any actual feedback from that. The editor may say that the submission is a better fit for another journal, for example, or a more specialized journal, but you don't get like actual detailed reviews from other scientists. Or the other decision that the editor can make is to actually send the submission for peer review. In this case, it also varies by journal and conferences, but it usually at least the submission will be sent to at least 2 reviewers, but it also can be more like 3 or 4 reviewers. So this starts a process where these different reviewers submit their independent reviews of the paper and then submit these reviews to the editor, who then again has to make a decision again. At that point, the editor can also decide to reject the paper, in which case it's called a rejection with review. And in this case, even though it's a rejection, you at least get some feedback from the reviewers, and you can basically work on that to submit to another journal, for example. But sometimes the editor will request revisions from you to actually improve the paper based on the feedback given by the reviewers, in which case the process where you submit a response to those reviews and then make changes to your original submission and resubmit the paper begins. And this can go on for a couple of cycles between until a final decision is made by the editor, either to reject the paper or accept the paper and become published. So now we'll move on to what it's like to review a paper. So when reviewing a paper, we're going to go over an example from one of Pranav's paper called Chexbird. Don't worry if you haven't read it, because we're going just to focus on basically how to develop a good review for papers, and not so much on the actual content of the paper in this case. But it's just good to have an example to go over with what could be a good or what could be a bad review for a paper. So the first question that comes to mind is whether you should accept the invitation to review the paper once you receive an email from a journal asking you to review. And there are a few things to consider in this case. First, you should consider whether this is actually your area of expertise. Sometimes it happens, at least it happens a lot in medicine, in that once you start reviewing for a journal, they will basically just spam your email with a lot of your inbox with a lot of different requests to review papers. And most of the time these fall into your area of expertise, but sometimes they don't. So you basically, if the paper is not something you know of, you can basically just reject that because of that. Then another important thing to consider when you are asked to review a paper is whether you have any conflicts of interest. For example, if you receive a paper from someone you know, a friend of you, a colleague, a close colleague or collaborator, it's usually best to just not review those papers just because of the conflict of interest. And the third thing to consider that is very important, just because in academia in general, we are all really busy with a lot of stuff, like our grants, for example, or our own papers that we have to submit. And sometimes reviewing a paper can take a lot of time. It's a very time-consuming task. So it's important to consider whether you actually have the time to dedicate to review these papers. One strategy that some people have is to just basically schedule a time to review papers, and they would just review one paper a week or something like that, but not more than that, which is an interesting approach. Okay, so once you decide that you accepted the invitation to review a paper for a journal, then this can also vary by different journals. So some journals will have a pre-specified format to conduct your peer reviews, and they will ask very specific questions that you can answer just by different choices in a web page or a platform, or they have a specific field to answer very pre-specified questions, or even just have a set of questions that you have to submit on your own in a Word document, but following that structure. But sometimes journals don't have that also, and it is still a good idea to, at least in your mind, have some kind of a structure of the things that you're looking for in a paper to actually have a strong opinion on whether you think it's a good study or not, and what things you think the author should do to improve the paper. So one of the main things to start with when reviewing a paper is to summarize the main ideas of the submission. So in this case, going back to the example of the paper by Pranav called Chexbird, This is an example that you can see in the slide of like, okay, for a start for a summarizing of the main idea of the paper. It provides some information, but it's a little bit incomplete and it's not as detailed as we would like. So a better example of how to summarize the main ideas for a paper is here now on the slide. So you can see that in this case, the reviewer actually specified what are the things, the main ideas behind this paper, and gives an overview of what he thinks that this paper is a solid, well-executed work, but there are a few things that are important to address to improve the paper. The second question that is very important to consider is whether the research question is explicit and well motivated. This is very important when reviewing the papers, because sometimes you have to put yourself in the shoes of other people that are not experts on the field that or the specific paper that you're reading, or in the entire field. So it's very important within the first paragraphs of the paper, especially within the introduction of the paper, is to have an idea is what the actual research question is, and how the authors are going to tackle that research question. So in this case, a reviewer could say the research question is unclear, but of course this is somewhat helpful, but not as helpful as providing a detailed feedback on how the research question is unclear. So a better response to that would be something like this. So you can specify the research question could be more explicitly stated. So in this case, from the Shakespeare paper, one possible feedback will be to suggest the authors explicitly state that the first study aims to test whether a pre-chambered on labels generated by current labelers and then fine-tuning it with expert annotations outperforms the current state-of-the-art methods in radiology report labeling. So as you can see in this case, then the message is relatively the same, that the research question is unclear in the introduction, but here the reviewer is also helping the authors that will read the feedback on how to improve actually the paper when resubmitting to the same journal or to another journal. Another important thing to consider is where the strengths, and this is one question that usually is pre-specified in many of the journals platforms when reviewing a paper, and also in many of the conferences, like the checklist provided by conference when reviewing these papers. And what are the strengths of this work? So here, of course, again, the review that is here conveying that the paper is of overall high quality. It's helpful somewhat by for the editor, but even though it probably will make the author feel good just because they have this good feedback, it is not very helpful overall to actually know what are the things that the paper does well. So a better response to this kind of questions, or a very important thing to mention, would be actually going over each one of the things that you think the paper is doing well. So, for example, with the example of Shakespeare, a few things coming from the actual review from the paper is just to mention the strengths of the paper. So in this case, the reviewer mentioned the paper is well written and easy to read. The study uses current transfer learning models for classification tasks and the paper also conducts a good study of existing literature in the subdomain of radiology. So this gives an overall much better picture to the editor of what the paper does well and what the paper does not in the following question. So kind of related to the previous question is, what are the weaknesses of this work? And here it's important to be as polite as possible when actually talking about the weaknesses of the work, and also to be as detailed as possible. And it's often useful to not only mention what are the weaknesses, but also actually making suggestions on how to improve these weaknesses. So in this case, as you can see, the response in the slide is somewhat informative. The paper has many weaknesses, including poor performance gains in the results and lack of needed information, which gives some information to the editor, but could be better. So a better way would be to actually be detailed also in the review and mention the performance gains with the Checksberg model compared to other models are very low, and the authors extract clinically important observations such as consolidation and edema, but they should indicate more deeply what is an important observation and what is not an important observation. And the reviewer asks, do they rely on any related articles to extract these important observations or not? So this is like very important to mention, just because it gives the author something to work with to actually improve the paper in a way that satisfies both the editor and the reviewer, but also actually is better to read for future readers of the paper. Okay. Another thing to consider when reviews these papers is whether the submission is clearly written and well organized. Here, sometimes, unfortunately, it's quite frequently, some reviewers would say something like the introduction is difficult to follow, and they would suggest that the authors include someone with English as a first language to proofread the manuscript, which is, of course, inappropriate and relatively rude. So please don't do this. A better way to express that the message of the paper is hard to understand would be something like this. So in this case, the reviewer is saying that the introduction will be difficult to understand for a reader that is not familiar with the task. And the reviewer then proceeds to describe what are the things that need to be better explained. So in this case, he says, a clear description of the application setting, types of data, clinical workflow involved, and where NLP methods can fit into that workflow will help make the work much more understandable to an unfamiliar reader. So this is very actionable feedback for the authors to take into account. And then, of course, other things that you should be aware of when reviewing is whether some acronyms are described or not. Like in this case, the reviewer points out there are many acronyms that are not described and should be described in the paper to actually make it more understandable to readers. Another question that usually comes to mind, and in medicine, this is a little bit different probably than in general in computer science work, is whether the statistical analysis is sound and justified. One thing that happens a lot with medical manuscripts and in medical journals is that reviewers will basically do not comment anything about the statistical analysis. And in general, it's because there is not a this is not an area of expertise for a lot of people in the medical field. But even if the statistical analysis is not something that you are an expert on, it's important to at least have a little background understanding of whether the paper would require a statistical review, a formal statistical review. So a lot of different journals have actually a way to send the paper to a formal statistical review by like a statistician. So it's helpful for the editors to at least say something like the statistical analysis seems sound, and whether you recommend a statistical reviewer or not. And this is also something that it's sometimes already pre-specified in the platform when you review papers, is whether you think the paper should be sent to a statistical reviewer or not. One other important point to look at when reviewing papers is whether you think you will be able to replicate the results of the study with the details that you find in the paper. This is very important, of course, in science, because the main idea is that you can basically check the results of a paper and see if they make sense, and then build upon those results. And it's especially important in anything related to AI research in medicine in general. So usually in AI research, the best way to actually make it reproducible is to just submit the entire code. But this is something that is not always possible. So at least the details on how to actually run the experiments is good to have. So here, the reviewer, for example, said that the results to replicate the study are missing, but of course, this is somewhat informative, but could be better. So a better review to actually help the editor and the authors is to specify what things are missing from the paper to actually be able to replicate it. So in this case, the reviewer can say that the authors do not give information about fine-tuning, which makes it difficult to reproduce the model. And one of the important questions that to ask about when reviewing this paper is whether the conclusion is connected with the argument made in the paper. And something that is very frequent during when reading these papers in the medical field in general, because a lot of the studies are just observational studies, and authors tend to overstate their findings or make claims that cannot be supported by the findings that are seen in the paper. So it's very important to check whether the conclusions and the final discussion of the paper actually cover the limitations of the paper, and whether they make, for example, causal claims that are not possible with the type of study that is done. So here, the reviewer says the authors overreach with the conclusion, which is again somewhat informative, but could be better explained. So a better way to put this into words is to be more detailed and said something like, well, the conclusion is somehow connected with the broadest argument of the paper. The authors have overstated the conclusion. In particular, they should have addressed limitation that this kind of methods, although highly performant, have with regard with rare conditions that occur in low frequencies. In this case, the radiologist could identify them thanks to his or her expertise, whereas an algorithm probably cannot if the data is unbalanced. So that this, of course, gives the authors much more to work with to actually mention this in the discussion if this is something that has not been mentioned before, and kind of limit their conclusions if they are over stated or out of sync with the type of study and the findings of the paper. Finally, a few things to consider is to look at the different tables and figures and see if they're easy to understand or not for the paper. So, for example, this is one of the figures from the Chexler paper. And one of the feedback could be just to say the figure 2 isn't clear, but of course, a much better way is to indicate how or what can be done to make it clear. So in this case, a good review would be to say that the authors indicate in text that the model has 14 linear heads for each one of the different clinical findings, imaging findings, as shown in figure 2. However, figure 2 only displays 3 heads. Please clarify this in the figure. So of course, this can be clarified either in the legend or like here when with the 3 pointers here, or with both ways, just to make more clear when the readers look at the figure and try to understand it. And finally, an important point is how to organize the review that you will submit to the paper. As I mentioned before, there are a lot of journals that have a predefined format to submit with predefined questions to respond to, but a lot of journals do not have this. And usually a good way to organize this is to first provide an overview like we went over in the first few slides, just to introduce what the main ideas of the paper are and what's the overall quality of the paper, and then go over and list first major issues that the authors and the editors should take into account when deciding about this or when improving this paper, and then a list of minor issues with the paper, like things like, for example, the figures problem that we mentioned before, or typos, or those kind of things that are not very not super relevant, but still need to be tackled. So this is basically an overview of how to review a paper. And of course, this is not comprehensive, and you can have different ways to do it and different things to ask yourself, depending on your style and depending on the type of paper that you review and depending of the field. But it's somehow kind of how the mentality or how the state of mind has to be when reviewing this paper, which is try to be empathetic with both the editor and the authors and give an overall response that can help both the editor make the decision and the authors improve their paper. Now I'm going to go over with how to actually, once you receive responses from a reviewer, how to actually respond to these reviews. So you get an email saying that the submission, thank you for submitting your paper to the journal, and that revisions are required, and they just list the comments that are made for the reviewers, by the reviewers, and that they look forward to receiving the revision within a certain amount of time. So you now have a list of things to tackle and had to do it in generally pre-specified amount of time that is usually short. And in this case, we're going to go over also a pre-specified set of things to take into account when responding to reviewers. But no, we're not going to go over a specific paper, just examples from different papers that we work on, or Prana has worked on, or even made up examples to try to specify the things that we should take into account. So the first thing, similarly to when reviewing a paper, so in this case, you're responding to the reviews, The first thing is to provide an overview of what you did with your paper when resubmitting. So one of the things that I usually did for the first few papers that I resubmitted is just to say, here are the point by point responses to the reviewers, which of course doesn't give a lot of information on what the overall changes of the paper are. And it's not very informative actually when the reviewers are reading the response or when the editor is reading the response about what happened with your resubmission. So a better way to specify things is to actually give an overview, thank the reviewers, and mention the important things that you have changed. So if the revisions that you got are not very important or not big, basically, probably you don't need to do this. But if you, for example, went on and found another data set and tested on an external data set your method, it would be good to specify that a big change has happened in the meantime. So in this case, for example, a good way to communicate this to editors and reviewers to say, we thank the editor and reviewers for the constructive comments and the possibility of resubmitting a revised version of the manuscript. In their response to this feedback, we introduced several modifications that we hope will contribute to better communicate the results of our study. And in particular, we have now conducted a validation study to address the concerns of reviewers 2 and 3. And below, please find our specific answers to each comment. And importantly, we can also specify that the modifications introduced in the manuscript appear as track changes in the revised version of the manuscript, so that reviewers and editors have a good idea how to actually go over the resubmission and see what the changes are. It's usually good to have track changes, but some journals also allow just to highlight or change the color in the changes that you made instead of using the actual track changes function in the Word editors. Another important point that is maybe obvious is to be polite and respectful to all reviewers, which sometimes admittedly can be hard just because sometimes reviewers are not polite. So we still have to be, in general, the better person and be polite or respectful. So something like what is in the slide is, of course, not appropriate to put on a review. Something like the reviewer 1 is not an expert, and therefore we dismiss her or his comments. Is of course not appropriate. A better way to respond is to say, thank you for your comments. We have made an effort to provide a more detailed and accessible explanation of the issues surrounding our study in this discussion, and then mentioning the changes that have been introduced and summarized in the following paragraph. Somehow connected with the previous point is to accept the blame. So sometimes you will write a paragraph in your paper that you think is very clear and very easy to understand, but reviewers will not understand it and say something that clearly states that they don't understand. So of course, it's not a good idea to say the reviewers to reread the mentioned paragraph. And it's always better to try to tackle this by rephrasing or being overly explanatory with the message that you're trying to communicate. So of course, the response written here is not something that you will do. Instead, something like, we thank the reviewer for the comment, and we have not rephrased and expanded this paragraph to better communicate our message. So in general, it's better to just accept the blame and be as polite as possible when trying to express and rephrase what you want to say in your paper. One thing that is very, very important is to make the response self-contained. And this is, again, a matter of trying to be empathetic, because as we mentioned at the beginning, in academia in general, people are very busy and they try to review the papers in different settings when they have few minutes, or well, while they are on the bus trying to go somewhere. So in their cell phones, they'll go over and review a paper. So we need to make it as easy as we can so that they can read the response that we write without having to go and open another document to have the information they want from the authors. So coming from the previous answer that we said, we thank the reviewer for the comment, and now rephrase and expand this paragraph to better communicate our message. That's good enough in the sense that it's polite and in general says what we do. But if the reviewer will actually try to see what we change, you will have to go to the manuscript and find the specific paragraph that you are mentioning and try to identify what the changes were. So a better way to save time for the reviewer and make him or her more comfortable is to just make the response self-contained by adding the paragraph that you change, for example. So in this case, it's just an example of the paragraph that was changed to accommodate the comment from the reviewer. So one other important thing is to be very careful when responding to reviews, is to respond to every point raised by the reviewers. And this is something that is sometimes difficult because sometimes the reviewer will write a very large point which specifies comments about one specific paragraph, for example, but they will ask two questions or mention two important things in the same paragraph, for example, or the same point raised. So in this case, for example, the reviewer, this is from a recent paper that we work on with Pranab. The reviewer will say something that this data or citing what the paper said, and then saying that the authors proceeded to reference 3 papers that had little relevance to this issue, and then said cycle counts were mentioned in the paragraph describing transformers. What is the relation? So it's sometimes tempting to just answer the first question, and it's sometimes easy to just miss the second question at all, and just respond to the first part of the reviewer's comment, like we did here, for example. So thank you for your comment. In this section, we refer to other multimodal learning tasks, including co-learning, blah, 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 and just show the text that we changed in the manuscript. But of course, in this case, we're forgetting about this second question raised by the reviewer. So a better way to actually respond to this is to not forget to respond to the second question, like we did in this second version of the response. Another important thing when writing this response to reviewers is to use typography to help the reviewers and editors navigate the response. So as you can imagine, when you have a large response with a lot of different comments, it can be very difficult to navigate your response because you have information about, you have text that is written by the reviewers, you have text that you write to explain your thoughts to the reviewer, and then because you're trying to make your response self-contained, you also have text that comes from your manuscript and it's just there to demonstrate what the changes that have been made. So as you can see, it's kind of difficult if you don't apply any type of change in the typography to gauge which part is which in this case. So a better way to do this is to actually just use different things to highlight each one of the parts. So in this case, for example, the reviewer part is just in black, the author's response is in blue, and the part that is coming from the manuscript, like as reference to the manuscript, is in italics. So this is the important point to take into account when writing this response to reviewers too. One other important point is to, whenever possible, begin the response with a direct answer to what the reviewer asked or the point being raised. So, for example, if in one paper you would like to describe something or bring some background from different papers to actually explain your thought process when writing a particular point in the discussion or a particular paragraph in the discussion, you can basically reference work by others in the review, even if you don't cite that in the paper. But usually it's best to first address the specific point made by the reviewer. So you can always say that your thought process and explain the context behind what you try to accomplish, but it just first make that the reviewer can just read the first part of your response and say, okay, they took care of what I said, and they heard my comment basically. So in this case, the first thing that we say is that we rephrase the paragraph to incorporate my context and clarify the message, and then went on to describe the different things that we took into account to do this. Another somehow very sometimes difficult thing to do is to do, when possible, what the reviewer asks. Because sometimes most of the time reviewers will ask something that it's relatively important to do, or changes that are important to do, but sometimes reviewer can suggest that you do some analysis that are not really pertinent or relevant to the actual work that you're doing. So it may be tempting to not do this just because it is beyond what the scope of your study was, and it usually will take a lot of time to just do this that you do not intend to include in your paper. But even if you think that, and even if you are not okay with adding something to your study, it's often better to actually perform any analysis if possible, just to show the reviewers that you heard their feedback, and that you actually took care to try to accomplish this. So in this case, a better response would be to actually say, we performed the analysis suggested by reviewer one, and go on to show the results of this additional analysis that you run. But you can always state that given that the manuscript focuses on a particular topic, and this analysis you think or you consider is out of scope of your study, that you do not want to incorporate this analysis in the paper itself. But it's much better to have the results when trying to do these responses than to just say it, because in this case, the review will not say that you didn't just want to do the analysis, basically. Somehow connected with what we said previously about the typography is to be clear about what changed relative to the previous version. And this is, of course, is very clear when you are working with track changes, but it's often usually helpful to also be as clear as possible in the response itself. So in this case, for example, also for a paper that we worked with Pranav recently, we can basically just write the paper saying what we changed and then cite the paragraph that we changed in the manuscript. But from this paragraph, we don't know what exactly is all and what has changed. So just a better way to communicate this is to highlight in red, for example, what's the new thing that you added to the paragraph or the change from the paragraph. And finally, if necessary, is somehow a good practice to write the response twice. So first, you will just basically sometimes meet with your mentor and co-authors and go over each one of the points raised by reviewers, and at least think about what the things that you need to do, like do an additional analysis by using a sensitivity analysis, expand this by mentioning a particular reference, and expand on the potential limitation, discuss what limitations are being missed. So this will act like a first draft of the response. But then the final response, you have to be very formal and very organized when responding to make it clear to reviewers and make it clear to editors, and have the actual formal document that it will submit to the journal. Okay, so this is all I have for today. Thank you very much for the attention, and thank you very much for the invitation, Brenda.
Thank you, Julian. Hold on, let me get rid of this echo. Okay, you should be able to hear me now. Thanks, Julian, for a wonderful overview of how to critique and then how to respond to those critiques. And I think those examples were very useful, certainly for me, and I'm sure for many others listening here. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.